Hello everyone. My name is Shao-yun and I am a professor of history at Denison University. And it's my honor this afternoon to interview my dear teacher, Professor Michael Nylan of the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Nylan is the author of many groundbreaking books on early Chinese intellectual history. And most recently, she was the first woman scholar to translate The Art of War into any modern language. And that actually brings me to my first question, which is really that if a person were to pick up your translation of The Art of War and saw your name, they would not immediately know that you were a female scholar.
Yes.
Because most of us, and this is true of me before I met you, assume that Michael is a man's name. This is actually kind of confusing to me. And I actually mustered up the courage to ask you how you got to be named Michael. But I'm sure a lot of people are curious, but are too polite to ask. So why don't we start with that, where you could maybe tell the story of how your name came to be, Michael.
My mother died when I was relatively young, so I never got a chance to pursue this question. But I do know that she told her female friends before the baby, sex unknown, was born, that no matter whether it was a boy or a girl, she was going to name it Michael. And I think they laughed. And certainly when I was born, I was quite a bit premature and my father was away from home on some business. And when he arrived at the hospital, he brought a little blue train, thinking, of course, I was a boy. And she laughed and said, no, you've got it wrong. Michael is a girl. My guess is that my mother, who believed in the saints, prayed to Saint Michael because she'd had a series of miscarriages before me. That's my guess. And she promised Saint Michael that if the baby was carried safely to term, the baby would be named Michael. It's been a wonderful name to have. And a terrible name to have. And the way it's both wonderful and terrible at exactly the same moment is that many people refuse to accept you, that your name is actually Michael. And you can tell a lot about people who don't accept that you might have an unusual name. But it's also been probably the reason that I've gained some friends from the wonderful way they responded to my name being Michael. So on balance, but also as a little child, because my family spent a lot of time in Mexico, I had little earrings. And no one in Kentucky had little earrings. And I think between Michael and the little earrings, I spent a lot of time saying how curious adults are. Why weren't they better trained to be more polite? So anyway.
Right. So that actually is a good way to move to my next question, which is I was wondering if you could tell us more about your childhood. You've told us a little bit about it already, and your early education as a child and how you think they shaped you as a person.
Thank you. I was definitely shaped by two people most of all as a child. And one was my mother. And from the age of 3 on, every week on Saturday morning, we went to the public library to check out books for me, books for her. And then she would take me to lunch on my own. Otherwise, my sister's much, much older. Otherwise, my brother was at home. So this was a special time for me that was all centered around book learning. And I realized that a lot of the people who love books have been plunked on their mother's lap at an early age. and they were reading books with their mothers. And so much later, when I worked with as a tutor for what is called reader refusers, people who are bright enough to read but refuse to do it for lots of different reasons. The chief thing I needed to do, they were between 5 and 7, was somehow get them on my lap and start reading with them and give them that sense that reading is pleasure. And over time, that helped some of them a great deal. I guess the other big influence would be my uncle, whom the Smithsonian listed as one of the most famous inventors of the 20th century. And he was a Polish emigre. He was my uncle by marriage. And he was an extraordinary human being. And he was childless, would always put me on his lap and either be reading to me or telling me about Egypt. He was fascinated by Egypt and what he called Oriental culture. And, I didn't know the difference between Egypt, China, and Japan. But I thought, this is a really smart, lovable guy. I want to somehow investigate Oriental culture. So there I was. I think they set me on the path.
So, again, a very good transition to the next question, which is when and how exactly did you decide it was going to be China and not maybe Egypt that you were going to study?
I decided for the oddest of reasons. I went to Kentucky didn't have at the time a single good school for high school or middle school. And so people in Kentucky tended to send their children away to school. And I had the good fortune to be sent to the Shipley School for Girls. And the head of the Shipley School for Girls had been head of Yenjing Women's College before 1949. Yenjing, of course, became the campus of what is today Peking University or Beida. And at the time, and there was a Yenjing Men's College, which was headed by Leighton Stewart, who later became ambassador to China. And the female school was headed by Miss Spear. This was a Quaker school, and so we would begin every morning by a half an hour of some edifying discussion. And Miss Spear brought in the most fantastically interesting people, including Eudora Welty, my favorite Southern writer. She was friends with everyone because her parents had founded the YMNYWCA. They were quite prominent as Christian educators, not proselytizers. And on mornings when no one was scheduled, Miss Spear would talk about her days in China. And I remember, and years later I told her, because she lived to be 99, every time she started talking about China, I would say to myself mentally in my impatient teenage way, I wish she would shut up. I'm never going to be able to go to China. And I don't need to hear this. So anyway, she definitely planted a seed. And when I, without telling my family in Kentucky that I was transferring from Stanford to Berkeley, because I found Stanford, though intellectually interesting, too much like a boarding school, I didn't trouble to see whether Berkeley had my major, which was going to be independent creative writing. And Berkeley didn't have that at that time, though of course they have it now. And so I thought, well, what would I like to do? Because I don't regret that I've transferred to Berkeley. And so I said, I'm going to take the oddest classes I can think of. And I decided Chinese was one of the oddest classes I could think of. And so I took Professor Levinson's last class at Berkeley and was really lucky to do that. And during that class, I remember people talking about the Chinese family, asking questions. And the person next to me, also a woman, said, "This is the weirdest thing I've ever heard of." And I said to her, "Actually, it's just like my family in Kentucky." And we looked at each other in mutual incomprehension, because I was brought up in the American equivalent of the Da Jiating. My grandfather, during the Depression, as the only one with money, kept everyone in the factories on full salary and educated every single cousin. And then gave them jobs if they couldn't find them after educating them. So I thought, no, the best of the large family tradition is alive and well in Kentucky, and now I know what to call it. I think that once I took Professor Levinson's class, I then took Fred Wakeman's class the next semester. And during that semester, of course, Levinson died. But I'd like to say one more story about Professor Levinson, because I really think it's probably a motivation for me continuing in Chinese studies against all the odds. When that was the middle of the Vietnam War, and I was a moviegoer. Every night at 9 p.m., I would quit studying and I would go to a movie. And afterwards, my boyfriend of the time would walk me across campus to my house. And we would always see Professor Levinson walking in the library. So near the end of the semester, lights on, blazing, everything, I went up to Professor Levinson and said, "Excuse me, I don't know whether this is too personal a question to ask you or not, but is it your work which is driving you to basically be up at all hours in the East Asian Library at Berkeley?" And he burst out laughing and said, no, there have been bomb threats, and they'll never bomb the library if a human being is in it. And so there was I don't know, since that was my first semester at Berkeley, how long he had been doing this. But certainly he had been doing it the entire semester I was at Berkeley. And I thought to myself, that man has guts. I want to know what he knows. And maybe if I study Chinese studies, I'll get to know what he knows. That's how naive I was at the time. Yeah.
So if I could move on to ask you about your decision to go to graduate school to study Chinese history after Berkeley. So it sounds like Professor Levinson inspired you, but what were the other inspirations behind that decision?
Well, I'll tell you, I looked around and there was not a single female teacher at Berkeley in history. I decided that I would become a Montessori school teacher, because what I enjoyed was seeing light bulbs turn on, including I like seeing my own light bulbs had turned on. And I would be perfectly happy teaching 3 to 5 year olds. In fact, very happy doing that. And so I applied to Montessori school and had been accepted, but they told me we don't have enough qualified applicants. At that time, there were only 2 schools, if memory serves, very few schools where you could train to become a Montessori school teacher. I had applied to the one in Cincinnati because I have relatives, cousins who live in Cincinnati, and it's not that far from Lexington, Kentucky, where my family lives. So I thought, okay, I'll come in a year. What do I do in the interim? And I thought what I do in the interim is I go up and visit my boyfriend, and I become a waitress for a year, and I'm perfectly happy to do that. I put myself in summers, often through school by doing odd jobs and selling maternity clothes, and none of this bothered me one bit. And by a fluke, I arrived in Buffalo and went into the history department there and said, I'm thinking of taking a course in the history department. I've just come from Berkeley and I wondered how I could sign up and what's being offered. The semester is almost ready to begin. And the secretary said, you're hired. And I said, what do you mean? She said, the graduate student who was to work for our teachers in Asian studies, all of whom were UC Berkeley PhDs, just left yesterday, and we're desperate to find somebody who could grade undergraduate papers. And I said, but I was just going to take a class. And she said, basically, you idiot, you'll now be paid for taking that class and grading those papers. So I said, great, okay, I will do this. So that was the first fluke, okay? The second fluke was in the spring, one of those teachers, David Abosh, the other was in Chinese studies, worked on Shao-yun. David Abosh walked up to me and said, congratulations, you're going to Cambridge, England next year. And I said, no, I'm not. I'm going to Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm becoming a Montessori school teacher. And he said, you're an idiot. You can become a Montessori school teacher after you go to Cambridge for a year. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, we in the department have applied for you. I couldn't have applied myself for the first Lehman Fellowship, state fellowship. You've got it. And it's enough money for you to go to Cambridge. And I said, well, why would I want to go to Cambridge? And he said, because you need to redo your undergraduate education. I said, I know I was striking for most of my undergraduate education, but I did do a lot of reading as well. He said, no, you need to take the Chinese tripos. And so I said, okay, that would be fun. And then I looked at the terms of the fellowship, and it meant you had to be registered in Buffalo, New York. And so I went back to David Abosh and said, well, you've called me an idiot, but the terms of the fellowship, I have to be in New York State. He said, independent study. You are going to Cambridge on independent study with people in the department and just go and quit offering objections. So I went to Cambridge and did nothing except studied Chinese language and Han history and a bit of work with Tim Barrett. Dennis Twitchett never showed up for any of his classes. He was professor, so he was always flying around. I got extremely good training. And the daggone fellowship was so much money that I could stay for a second year. I, as it happened, took off for Harvard for 1 year, and then I had wanted to work with Yang Liansheng, but that was impossible. So I came back to Cambridge and spent the money for a second year at Cambridge, and basically finished the tripos by doubling up on courses. And so I took first year and second year Chinese simultaneously, and third year and fourth year Chinese simultaneously. I wasn't the brightest light bulb in the class, but I passed. It was an informal exam anyway, because you can't take the tripos unless you are there for at least a certain number of years. But I took the exams and I passed. So there I was.
So just a pretty extraordinary sequence of unexpected events.
Yes. I have someone whom I deeply admire as a philosopher called Lee Yearly. And what I mean by have him, I've just been reading him. And he talked about how important it was to have a life plan. Though I deeply admire him and admire the rest of the essay, I am steeped enough in what is feminist care ethics to know that women don't develop life plans that they expect to be able to hold to. They expect to be interrupted by children, by family illnesses, by this, by that, I think I've never believed in the autonomous rational being of the Anglo-American philosophical tradition, that if people thought about how I got to be an academic, they would condemn it as improbable fiction. So, so there I am.
So after you went on to do the PhD at Princeton, you did your dissertation on the Feng Shui Tong Yi by Ying Shao. What went into that choice to focus on this text?
Well, although I'm often identified as an intellectual historian, I never wanted to be one. I wanted to be a social historian. I wanted to be what many people now would call a cultural historian. And so I had wanted to work with Professor Yang because in his generation, he was simply the best, in my belief, in his generation, covering everything. And by the way, he was a graduate of Yenjing Men's College. As were many of my teachers, including James T.C. Liu at Princeton. I was very close to Professor Liu, and he always was a very strong mentor for me. It may have been the Miss Spear connection, or it may just have been that we got along. But I always wanted to do something that would fulfill two conditions. One would be, it would be in social history. The second one would be that it would be a topic way too large for me. Because I assumed I'd never get a job. And so I wanted something that in a sense I could feed on for years and years and years, all the unanswered questions that the thesis had generated. I became interested in two figures above all. One was Yang Sheng, and I was not allowed to work on Yang Sheng, nor was I allowed to have Professor Sivan as my outside person on my committee. Then it was clear it was going to be Ying Shao. because he was in the thick of politics, and trying to imagine what later in life I would come to call the politics of the common good. Really trying to see in a very beleaguered time, what can we salvage from this? And a deeply learned person. And so I mostly thought I was going to work on the chapter on ghosts and spirits. But to tell you frankly, I could translate it, but had no idea what it was actually about. And I think because a lot of the work on Chinese medicine had not yet been done, that I needed to understand that chapter. But I was somewhat capable of putting Ying Shao together with the Yuan family in a specific time and place, and a specific set of issues. So I really loved doing my thesis, though Princeton was famous for offering almost no guidance to students doing their theses. To tell you the truth, most of my 同学 were from Taiwan, and they had already gotten MAs from Taida. And really, they didn't need much guidance. It was people like me who I was not as well trained and ready to write a PhD. Luckily, I became the project of all my Taiwan 同学. I mean, quite literally, each and every person. And I should also emphasize Andrew Law, who was from Hong Kong. All of them sat down and read texts with me. They showed infinite patience. And really, that's how I made it through. And I made it through well enough to get a postdoctoral fellowship. But then my advisor, Fritz Mote, said, "You're a woman working in a non-existent field. There are no jobs. There is no future. Why would you want to keep up with this?" And so he refused to sign the dissertation, though it had been laying on his desk for 6 to 8 months by then. Not because it was perfectly finished, but just because I realized without more help from my advisors, it was not going to get much better. So I was turning to the Yangsheng project, and still trying to do corrections on the worst of the thesis. Anyway, I was rescued by Andy Plax, and I definitely owe him the rescue. He said, "I'm your new advisor." I said, "I've never taken a class with you. I've been in a reading group with you, but I've never been in a class." He said, "I'm your new advisor. And I will conduct the examination at Princeton. And I'll pass over that examination, which turned into a shouting match among a number of different people with different points of view. But anyway, I survived it and went home, and immediately I had a phone call from Nathan Sivan. And Nathan Sivan said, "How did you do?" And I said, "Well, I actually don't know. After an hour of shouting, I just left because I really didn't care. It was going to sort itself out." And he said, and I now realize he was definitely lying, my exam was exactly like that. Don't worry. Just don't pay any attention, trying to make me feel better about what had gone on. And he said, and we're working on Yangsheng, and we need to focus on that. And that was the best advice I could ever get. Just, you've had a disappointment, so what? People have disappointments in life. It's what you do with them and how you move on. So looking back, I think I've been saved by a number of people at various points with timely good advice and real mentorship. Yeah, I think I've been on balance extremely lucky in what I've done.
So you've mentioned a number of the mentors who kind of made a big difference to you getting started in the field, despite all the odds. James T.C. Liu, you mentioned, Professor Nathan Sivin, Andrew Plax. Was there anyone else that you think belongs on the list that hasn't come up yet?
Yes, I think Chen Shun Zheng at Taida, Chu Wanli, whom I got to know when he was working on the rare books catalog at Princeton. And I was lucky enough to take a course on the odes one semester and on the documents in the second semester. William Hong at Harvard, Francis Cleves, who really wanted to be my mentor, had been gored by a bull. And he asked William Hong to take over his classes. And so I had William Hong teach me at Harvard. And, I don't think you can get better than that in terms of Chinese teaching, to have the list of people who invested some time and effort in me, though I completely, for example, with Chu Wanli, didn't have a clue what he was talking about. And I've been working on the documents, and 6 years later, I can read his 1957 Shangshu Jinju Jin Yi, and I finally understand what his notes are about. It was really lost on me. But all of these people loved what they were doing, as did and do Michael Lowy and Nathan Sivin. And so I think that is what you really want in a mentor, people who show you that they love what they're doing, and try to teach you at whatever level you're at, however pathetic it is. So anyway, yeah.
So could you tell us about how you got your first job after you finished at Princeton? I think you just mentioned a little while ago that your original advisor said there are no jobs in this field because the field doesn't even really exist, let alone for female historians. So how did it work out? Because I know that you were at Bryn Mawr for many years.
Happy there. I'll back up a little bit because it's again about a crazy series of happenstances. When I had to refuse the ACLS postdoctoral grant, I wrote a very polite letter to Jason Parker, and he was either at the top of or second in command at the ACLS. I didn't know him. It turns out he was a Princeton PhD. And he said in his return note to me, also by letter, not by email, Professor Mote did the same thing to me. It may be relevant that I am Black. I urge you to apply again. So I thought, gee, I might be able to get it again. And so what will I do for a year? And so I catered for a year. I baked bread and I made meals for people in Princeton. And by the way, I delivered all that stuff on the back of a bicycle. I didn't have a car. So that was a kind of crazy year, but I reapplied, not with the old project, but with the Yangshong project to ACLS, and I got it. So I was able to spend a year working on that project. And then in that year, the Bryn Mawr job became advertised. And I thought to myself when it was advertised, well, I went to high school in Bryn Mawr. Many of my teachers were Bryn Mawr College teachers, including Mrs. Riley, C.C. Riley, a famous English teacher at Bryn Mawr. At least I'll know the right suit I should wear if I apply to Bryn Mawr College. And so the department at Princeton, then headed by Marion Levy, God bless him, wrote a letter that looked to be a collective letter from the whole department, where everybody contributed a paragraph. And although Fritz Mote wasn't there, there were so many other people there. It was well hidden that I had finished my PhD under a cloud. So the letter went off, and otherwise, I think I asked Michael Lowy and Nathan Sivan. I got an interview. They had misadvertised the talk. I had said I'm going to talk on early Han, Western Han cosmology, and they had advertised the talk as being about cosmetology. And the poster, and I'm sure nobody looked at it, carefully. I mean, they would have been horrified that this is what the poster said. Anyway, I gave my talk, and when the talk was over, of course, it was all these complicated notions of yin-yang wuxing and the I Ching and the Tai-Shan Jing, because they said it should be on your work going forward, not on your past work. They specified that. So I adhered to that. What happened was the head of the committee, who was an art historian, stood up and said, I haven't understood a single thing you said. And I thought to myself, well, why should he understand? This is not Freudian analysis of art historical works, which was his specialty. And so I laughed and just started all over again and said, look, here's what you need to know. And this is all you need to know. And that's the bottom line. And I'm at the beginning of this project because you made me specify that I do new work. And so I have a lot of things to figure out myself before this project is over. Anyway, at the end of the lecture, someone said to me, well, you'll be hearing from us over the weekend. Well, I didn't hear from them. So I thought, well, that's pretty obvious. And then 10 days later, someone called me and said, well, we need to talk about your office. And I said, what are you talking about? And they said, well, of course, we thought you understood that you got the job. I said, no, I didn't understand that. Not one bit, because I was competing against a woman who was extremely good in Chinese architectural history. And I knew her work and admired her work and still admire her work, and we're good friends. I thought, of course they'll hire her. She's a more polished and finished and published person than I am. For whatever reason, and for many years, I thought it's because I wore the right gray suit. Bryn Mawr took me. I began to teach the only things I could teach, because Princeton didn't teach you how to teach, still often doesn't teach you how to do that. I was really never sure how to put a lecture together. I have to say that two people took me under their wings, and then the whole archaeology and the city's urban history program were continually offering me help and asking me to sit on their committees for their PhD students and training me. This is what, you know, a grown-up looks like. And I particularly would have to single out Jane Kaplan in the history department, and Steve Salkever, who was in political philosophy. I co-taught for them. I learned so much from them. And then when he came, Gary McDonough was great in the cities program. So I really was as lucky as I could be, but nonetheless, this was supposed to be 1 year. So I duly applied for a Fulbright. I got the Fulbright. I went in and said, this has been an incredible year for me. Thank you so much. I've learned so much, and I'm off to Taiwan. And they said, well, we have a proposition for you. We were hoping you'd be here next year. And I said, no, I've already accepted the Fulbright. And they said, well, would you come back? But you'd have to come back as a postdoc because we don't have the money as of yet for a position. But we would like to start to try to raise the money for such a position. I said, oh God, it would be incredible. It would be everything, you know, I would hope for. And I was incredibly lucky. Bryn Mawr had one of the Boxer indemnity funds. And from the Boxer Rebellion on, they had an exchange where every year one student came from China and stayed for 4 years, and they sent one student to China, to Yanjing. And so they had a vigorous Chinese presence, always filled with people interested in China. And they had an incredible collection of Chinese artifacts, including a Banpo pot, Yangshao Banpo pot, but many, many things. No one had done anything with them. So they started to raise money for this position. And the day I was tenured was the day I quit being a postdoc, quite literally. And so again, I think it was just being in the right place at the right time, and for reasons that make no sense in retrospect. I could get a job, and a job I loved. So, yeah.
So my next question has to do with what the field of early China was like in the 1980s when you began teaching at Bryn Mawr. How was it different from today?
I have to say that it was every meeting I went to, jaws would drop when I walked in because I would be the only female at the meeting. I also have to say that the editors of Early China at that point had said in public meeting at AAS that they wished they could accept pieces from women scholars, but women simply had inferior brains. And we simply weren't up to it. And by the way, I think a lot of the women walked out at the meeting as members. Only one male walked out. if memory serves. Now, not everybody had to think that was the only way to deal with this statement, but I've always loved Mark Csikszentmihalyi for being the one male who walked out of that meeting. It's been a pleasure to work with him as a colleague. So I didn't even know him then, except I think we introduced each other. But anyway, our firm friendship was cemented. I've had many people ask me whether they thought I was published because my name was Michael, and had I changed my name to be Michael. I don't know, because I would like to think that the places I was first published were paying attention to the reader's reports, not to the name. But the first places I was able to publish were Tongbao, my very first publication, Monumenta Serica pretty soon afterwards, and the Journal of the American Oriental Society. Those have all been places that have been pretty open to women. I have to say, and I think this is relevant to your question, when I applied for fellowships from Bryn Mawr, and I was at Bryn Mawr for 13 years, I don't believe I ever got a single fellowship. And when I instead moved to Berkeley and became Michael, not so, obviously perhaps a woman, although Bryn Mawr has plenty of male teachers, I began getting fellowships on that. And it was day for night that when I was at Bryn Mawr, never to my memory got a single fellowship. Berkeley, the first time I applied to 7 grants giving organizations, and I got 6 of the fellowships. In fact, I had to turn them down. And so I do think that there was a great deal of prejudice. There was a great deal of feeling also that the early China field was so new. Would it be able to make an impact? Or would it be safer to invest in people who were in more established fields? So I think that was part of it too. And so very early on, a lot of my first invitations were from England or Paris or Germany or one place or another, where early China had never not been around. When I was looking at graduate schools, one reason I went from Harvard to Princeton was otherwise you would have to work in Shang and Western Zhou, either with Professor Keatley or by going to Chicago. And I knew quite firmly I wanted to work in the early empires. So I wasn't about to change that. And so I think, and now I see, and it's certainly not taken very long for the field both to become an important field. You and I think we're both listening this morning to a Needham Research Institute talk, a series of talks that was about early China, disability in China. And at one point that was the high, there were 91, but the low of listeners was in the high 70s. And so I think we're just in another world now. I think that in a sense, the sky's the limit, meaning there is so much new material. None of us can claim to be a master of everything. At least none of us who is not foolhardy would claim that. It's really a pleasure for me to be in contact with so many people whose main goal is to do it right, to get it right, and not to say, this is my possession, this is my field, and you can't enter in it. Of course, in every field there are exceptions, but most of the people in my field are wonderful. We have wonderfully open and frank discussions, and they read things of mine and I read things of theirs. And I'm very happy to be in the field I'm in. The 学海 that I have plunged and I'm swimming in. So
you've told me that recently you've been thinking a lot about this concept of scholarly practice, of habits of thinking or habits of doing that are good for a scholar to have. So would you mind shedding some light on this concept and what it means to you?
Yes, I think that the gravest errors that people make as scholars is by not realizing that scholarship is basically about putting one foot in front of the other. And what I mean by that is Madame Pirazzoli Serstephans, whom I was privileged to know, kept saying, you have to be like an archaeologist. You have to patiently accumulate evidence and not evaluate it prematurely. Where people go wrong at the highest levels or at the most junior is they grab onto an idea before the idea is fully cooked, before they know that that makes sense in light of all the available evidence. I'm also aware that we have about 1/100th of what used to exist, so that anything I say tomorrow might be overturned by the publication of something. And there are people who can't stand that. And then there are people like me who says, great, now I'm really going to learn something that I didn't know before. So the book title, The Past is a Foreign Country, they do things differently there. And Darren LaHoo's kind of epigram is about the Romans. The Romans didn't see things differently. They saw different things. Have been kind of my guiding principles. And I'm a very happy camper because of this. And I have to say, I recently was able for the first time in well over a year to visit Nathan Sivan, my old mentor, and he's hard at work and cooking, and it's the same idea. He loves getting into an exchange about, I thought it was this. No, I think it's this, and here's my evidence, and blah, blah, blah. And I talk twice a week with Michael Lowy because we got into this habit when we were co-editors and his wife was dying. And I realized that email was not going to work. He was always responding to the wrong email at the, so we were talking at cross purposes. So I began phoning him twice a week. And that too, of course, has really sustained me because here is a person, he'll be 100 sway on November 2nd. And every time I call him, he's telling me about his latest research project. So anyway, and we're exchanging views and hunches and, papers. I hope to visit him in early summer. And if I can, we've all been vaccinated. That's a year overdue. So then we'll exchange papers with each other and go through the material. So I think um, I've been thinking a lot about practice because some of my colleagues have, I won't say flourished because we've all been worried during the pandemic about how this would affect our universities and how it would affect our friends and families. But aside from that worry, many of us have flourished. And I think it's because we realize more and more everything is one step at a time and a complicated workaround. But more than ever, I've been sharing things with people, saying, "You want this? Here it is. Give me yours in return." And it's been, aside from all of the things that are truly worrisome, including our own political culture, a very good year in some respects. So.
So my next question is, what are you working on now and what do you find the most interesting about it?
Well, I'm working on a ton of stuff, and maybe I should have said this is part of my practice, that when I feel I'm getting frustrated, I simply move to a different research project. And so I'm back and forth, one step at a time. So I'm writing for two different and new Cambridge histories. One is devoted to the history of democracy before AD 1350, and one is devoted to Confucianism. And I said right away, I'm not calling my essay Confucianism, but classical learning. And you'll have to put up with a paragraph as to why it's not Confucianism. But the editor said, fine. And so I've been lucky in both of those. I'm also about to finish, meaning almost everything is in draft, and then I need to connect with my co-author on a book called The Four Fathers of History. My co-author is Suzanne Said, a specialist in Greek. And she will do Herodotus and Thucydides, and I will do Sima Qian and Ban Gu. The Ban family, I should say. In any case, it's been interesting as someone who's been using Hanshu now for the better part of my life, how little I really understood about Bangu's project. 6 years into the project, I'm pretty sure I can nail it. I owe lots of help to lots of people on nailing it, but I think I have a coherent account. So those are the things that are right on the radar screen, and the Cambridge history essays are time dated. One of them is due May 15th. The only reason The Four Fathers hasn't been finished is because Suzanne and I need to see each other face to face. And she's in Paris, and every time I try to go to Paris, it's in lockdown. So that has put this off for about a year, but you know, a year more thinking and a year more checking never hurts. But I have two small projects. Oh, I just finished the Documents Classic in translation for the University of Washington Press, and that's out to readers. I think going forward, I have two projects, and both of them are dear to my heart. And I've gathered a lot of material about them. The first one is The Politics of the Common Good, mainly in early China, but as with most of my writing, there'll be a final chapter on contemporary outcomes. And then I would like to do an extremely small book, probably with Chinese scholars, on Zhang Di's reign. So it wouldn't be another Chang'an 26 BCE. It would probably be 4 or 5 essays rather than 20 some. But I think Zhang Di's reign presents such an interesting contrast with late Western Han that you can really see all the changes that have taken place in the interim and where we got a lot of ideas going forward, where Zhengshan got his ideas, for example. So I think those lines can be traced now in interesting ways.
So
So
you're saying Han Zhangdi's reign, basically
Zhang
the age of
Di's reign,
Angu, the age of
yes,
Angu,
and
essentially.
it's everyone who is fantastically smart
Mm.
is there in Zhang Di's court.
Right,
So it's
right.
very much like Cheng Di's reign.
Mm.
The chief ritual masters, Zhang Heng is there, I believe, though I have to recheck that. But go down the list, one person after another is alive and well. And as Michael Lowy has proven, nothing is ever the same after Zhang Di. In a sense, there are different ways you can end the Eastern Han, but the court begins to go south already in He Di's reign. It is briefly put back on course by Deng Sui, not by An Di. And then, it wanders along. But by AD 140, as Michael will prove in a forthcoming publication, the court has no more money, and it's quite evident. They can no longer give out rewards, orders of honor, which come with land as well as titles with them. And so, really, we should be dating the end of Eastern Han to 140, I think. And what we have is an incredibly long transition. Zhang Di is the pinnacle, there's no question, of Eastern Han. And I'd like to catalog that pinnacle, and then what happens afterwards in a final chapter. Yeah.
So you're also the co-author of a work of historical fiction
Yes,
called
I
Blossom on
am.
the Run, and
I
I
am.
believe it happens to be set in that period of Eastern Han as well,
It,
the time of
it,
Wang
it,
Chang.
it
Um,
is.
so, could you tell us the story of that novel, and also where you intend to write a sequel? I seem to have heard that it might be a trilogy, or at least that
Yes,
was
it
how it's
was.
planned.
It was planned as a trilogy, and my co-writer Bob Litz died on the day he was coming up to begin work on the second volume, coming up from Los Angeles. What happened was I was orphaned at 10. I wanted to write a children's book for a 10 or 11-year-old, in a sense, to introduce people to China. And the way I was introduced, at least to the Orient, at an early age. And so Bob was a playwright and screenwriter, and a damn good one. And he could write the dialogue, and I could set up the scenes and write passages of, narrative flow. Because after all, that's what I do anyway. And this wasn't that different. So I would comb through archaeological reports to see how the palace might have been decorated, et cetera, et cetera. think about Kuai-ji as a particular sort of place that Blossom might have made it to through various connections. So anyway, I think I had great fun doing this, and I know that a friend of mine is translating it into Chinese. She has a lot of other things on her plate. It won't be quick. But the really incredible news, and I won't count on it, is I have a friend who lives outside Paris who is a quite celebrated novelist. And she knew Bob, and she knows me. And she said, when I finish my next novel, I'll need a break. Perhaps I could do volume 2 with you. And I said to her, I think I need to see first that you finish this novel, because frankly, she put off working on the novel for me to finish my pleasure book. I came to visit her, and she was supposed to be working on her novel, and I was supposed to be working on my pleasure book. This was on the island of Naxos. And all she did was take care of me. She fed me. She took me on sightseeing the minute I said, I can't take this anymore. um, she surrounded me with care in the last 2 weeks of handing that in to the publisher. And I thought, what I don't want is for it to be so lopsided again. I would like to bring her to America. She has many friends here. She lived part of the time in Princeton. I got to know her through the de Grazias, well known in Princeton, the brothers de Grazia. She married one of them. And I think I'd like to bring her to a place she would find lovely. And then I take care of her, but I feed her enough for her. Bob and I had laid out a rough outline of volumes 2 and 3, just so we knew when volume 1 would end. So anyway, we'll see if this happens, and if it doesn't happen, it'll be fine. Something else will happen. My chief concern right now is that Ami finish everything the way she wants to finish her own work, and we'll see the next chapter of how this goes. So, yeah.
So this might be my last question, but it's a big one. Obviously you have no intention of slowing down. You have lots of projects, lots of exciting things to do. Novels, translations, articles, books. But you've also begun talking about retirement and what you would like to have time to do after retiring, maybe in a few years from now, that you haven't had time to do before. So would you like to share some of your plans?
I love teaching and I hate administration. And one of the facts of being a senior woman at Berkeley is there are not so many of us. So we're put on administrative committees in ways that no man would ever be asked with such rapidity. We are, in theory, a faculty-governed university, and that means that every major promotion must be reviewed by an ad hoc committee. And what it means in the middle of the semester is you can be given up to 2,000 pages of work to review and carefully write a report on with no warning, and you have a month to do it. You can imagine what this feels like. It doesn't feel good. Although I've learned things from the things I've reviewed, I would say it's never come at a convenient moment. You're trying to finish something, your student's PhD, or your this or that, something that you think is also time dated. And suddenly you have to work on this report. I won't miss that. I won't miss the administrators often ignoring the reports by the outside committees that you have carefully crafted with your colleagues to be fair and unbiased as possible. I won't, there are things I will not miss. I've been so happy in the students I've had at Berkeley that has probably kept me at several junctures from quitting already. I think it will be touch and go. I think one morning I'll wake up and just say, I'm ready to retire. As you may or may not know, Michael Lowy had, I think, published 2 books before he retired. One would have been Crisis and Conflict, and one would have been Records of Han Administration. And although he had produced essays and important essays, now you go to see how productive he's been. I don't aim to be Michael Lowy in retirement. I promised a dear friend of mine that I would never write another book that would be longer than 150 to 200 pages. And that's because I just finished the monster project of the documents. I think they're wrong, but the first guesstimate was it's 1,800 pages long. And what I can tell you is it was a hell of a lot of work, and not the kind of work I'm particularly good at. So I needed a lot of checking, rechecking, and I had a wonderful Chinese co-author without whom I could not have done that work, because I would type the wrong character and boy, she saw it right away. I'm blind as a bat, and not much better with my glasses on. And really, I owe her many, many things in this process. So it's small books for me going forward, but I do have lots of ideas about books, things to fill in holes. Here's how I feel about my work. I want eventually to know most of the texts that the people whom I study knew. And of course, I won't know them as well as they knew them, and all those other things that are missing, of course, will be lost to me. But I almost don't care what topic I write on, because I think I learn things all the time from things I thought I was never interested in. So Corinne Chemla, for example, asked me to be in her project about mapping. And I thought, what do I know about mapping? I don't know anything about mapping. And the same when somebody asked me to deal with roads. And it's been like this time after time that I really think, gee, why did I not even understand that this was an interesting topic? I was just doing it because a friend asked me. And so I said, yeah, I'll fill a slot. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'll fill a slot. So I think as I discover holes, I usually just say curious, this, need to think about. And so I can't imagine, um, none of us knows how long we have to live, but I can't imagine if I'm lucky enough to be of sound body and mind, that I wouldn't enjoy this till my dying day. I literally visited Herb Fingerette on the day before he died. And or maybe the day he died. I know the date, um, but he was great to talk to right up to the end, and he had patches of memory not so good, but get him on a philosophical topic, none better. He would immediately poke holes into what you had just spouted, and explain why those holes needed to be poked. And so I really love these people, whom I've known right up to the point of their deaths, who have loved um, this engagement as long as they were alive. So that's what I hope. And for the moment, I'm in rude good health, so far as I know. And yeah, just take it one step at a time. So.
Thank you very much. It's been such a pleasure conversing with you, learning about your life story and about your work. I knew some of it already, but there was so much more that I learned just from this hour talking to you. So thank you on behalf of all the viewers. And actually, would you have a message for young scholars in this field, early China, who are just starting out, and that maybe you want to say something to them in closing?
I guess I want to say, and it's not much of a message, two things. One, if you can imagine states of being different or conditions different than your own, the early China field welcomes you. Because that's what we have to think about all the time. What are we seeing that doesn't comport with our assumptions? And I guess I was at dinner last night with a dear friend, and we were talking. We hadn't seen each other for a couple of months. I said, I cut out of the New York Times today something, and I'm trying to figure out how to use it. And he said, what is it? And I said, it was said about a woman, niceness was not her project. And I thought, I say to all the women out there, you don't have to be rude, but you have to realize that niceness is not the project. The project is to become a human being by thinking many thoughts that don't occur naturally. And therefore expanding your horizons. And I guess why that comes to mind is one of my very brightest students, in fact, more than one of them, who are female, preface every question that they ask by saying, well, I'm sure this is a stupid question, or, and it is my job as their teacher to say, first, there are no stupid questions, but when was the last time you heard a man preface his question by a disquisition about how stupid he is? And so I urge women to be in the field, and I urge people, male or female, Chinese or non, who have a historical imagination, a willingness to, if you love novels, you probably have it, to think outside that box. So it's a good field to work in. Thanks.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
It's been such a pleasure to be interviewed by one of my favorite people, because it hasn't felt like a grilling, which it otherwise would, I think. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. The pleasure's all mine.
No, shared.
Shared. Yeah.
Common good.
Mhm.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.